Well, welcome to the 10th talk, which we split into two parts. The first part will deal with the growth of Christianity from the period of 400 to 1700, and also to do with parliamentary democracy and how it developed. The second part, which will be another video, will be on the Reformation, and that will look at the Reformation from the perspective of the book of Revelation. So let's talk about the expansion of Christianity. And really, one must remember that outside of the Roman Empire, Christianity also existed. Two major areas of Christianity outside the Roman Empire was the Persian Church, which became known as the Nestorian Church. And it had to keep itself very separate from the Romans because the Persians were considered, were Rome's enemies. And it didn't want to be associated with the Roman Church for that reason. Now, they were a missionary church which sent missionaries into Central Asia, into China, and also into India. Now, there is some evidence that maybe India had Christians before then, and the church in Kerala suggests that that came from St. Thomas. Now, in the church, the Persian church kind of declined from about the 10th century onwards, and sadly was all but destroyed by Tamerlane in the 15th century. The other church to look at would be the Ethiopian Church, and of course that was the eunuch who Philip brought to salvation, and he went back to Queen Candace and no doubt spread Christianity from there. We know that the Jews had a strong tradition in Ethiopia before then. They even suggest that the Queen of Sheba came from Ethiopia. And certainly for the eunuch to be going to Jerusalem suggested that there was a very strong Jewish influence in Ethiopia at that time. The church in Ethiopia is still there today, and it has effectively evangelized much of that part of Africa. And it has a very strong connection with the church in the Coptic church in Egypt. And I believe Athanasius was one of the first people to send missionaries down to Ethiopia to support the church there. Within the Roman Empire, the empire split into two. There was the eastern half and the western half. The eastern half was based around Constantinople, and that church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, survived as a part of the empire right up until the middle of the 15th century when the Turks finally overran it. But the Orthodox Church is still there in Greece, also in Russia, where the missionaries went to. And there's evidence of Orthodox churches throughout the Middle East as well. Regarding the West, the empire in the West collapsed in the 5th century. And it was overrun by tribes, some of which had Christian background to them, some which did not. But none of them were particularly good at maintaining the education and the institutions of learning that the Roman Empire had. And as a consequence, the ability to read and write largely was lost in the West, and that's why it's often called the Dark Ages. But the Anglo-Saxons who attacked Britain basically had no interest in Christianity and wiped it out from England, certainly. And if it wasn't for the fact that 100 years before, a young man called Patrick had been taken as a slave to Ireland, having been captured by pirates. That young man had a dream from God that he was to evangelize Ireland. And so having escaped and got back to England, he basically got himself trained up and went back to Ireland as a missionary. Was incredibly successful. As a consequence, Ireland became essentially a Christian nation. Education, learning and writing was kept alive in Ireland throughout the period of the Dark Ages. And from Ireland, missionaries were sent to Scotland, Columba, who set up a mission station in Iona, beautiful island off the west coast of Scotland. And from there, Aidan was sent to Northumberland, and Aidan set up a missionary centre in a place called Lindisfarne, or Holy Island, off the coast of Northumberland. And the north of England was evangelized through Aidan and his monks. To the south, at the same time, around about the end, I think it's 587 AD, Augustine was sent by the Bishop of Rome Gregory the Great, to evangelize the English. And so between the two of them, England was effectively evangelized by the 7th century. It would be a nice story to finish it there, but unfortunately, things don't work out quite so nicely in history. The Vikings arrived, a bit like a dose of salt, and they destroyed almost everything that had been established by the Saxon Christian kingdoms. So in, I think it was 793, they destroyed the Holy Island, and by the time of 870, all but one of the 7 kingdoms of the Saxons had been destroyed by the Vikings, and much of Christianity was also destroyed. The one kingdom to remain was Wessex, and one of my great characters in history was Alfred the Great. And Alfred the Great managed to stop the Viking invasion of Wessex, and such was his Christian character, and genuinely I believe he was a Christian. He, rather than destroying the Viking forces of Guthrum at Chippenham, when he had them in his power to literally eliminate, he basically said to Guthrum, if you're prepared to be baptized, I'm prepared to essentially give you half of England, and we'll just have the other half. And that's what we call Danelaw. And this time, Guthrum has made many promises in the past and broken every one of them. This time, Guthrum did take the promise seriously, and Christianity thrived in his part of the world, and peace was established between Guthrum and Alfred. And even when Vikings tried to invade Wessex in the years afterwards, Guthrum never joined them. Such was the character of Alfred that he really led the nation as a servant king. And I think that was a really important foundation for the Kingdom of England. He gave to the English education. He even translated some of the books of the Bible into English himself. He set up a system of fortified towns called burghs, many of which are still existing. He created a system of government whereby there was the beginning of the shires, and that was his successors established that, so that even today those shires still exist as our counties. And the good government based on godly laws was what he established. He even created the first Royal Navy in order to stop the Vikings from attacking. Well, such a nation that had been created was, in fact, way in advance of anything that was around in Europe. And as a consequence, it was a real tax-raising jewel in the crown of anybody who wanted to take us. And unfortunately, there were a number of nations that would like to take this nation of England because it was such a rich place to tax, shall we say. So Canute from Denmark is the next person who does that. And he basically overthrows the Saxon kings around about 1000. And after him comes the famous Duke William of Normandy, who again has a tenuous link to the throne. But in 1066, the most famous date in English history, takes over this nation. And it's really rich pickings for him because it is a wonderful place to tax. And his Doomsday Book of 1087 is testament to that. And also it gives him the role of being a king as opposed to just being a duke. Now, as time goes by, it becomes obvious that there's a problem here because England is now linked to a French family who have properties in France, which means for the next 400 years, we'll be always, at some point or other, fighting the French over these properties. And this means that the kings always are having to raise money to send armies across. Now, to get consent to raise that money is an interesting question. And that brings us to the incident of the Magna Carta, when King John had failed in his battles, but had cost a small fortune in the consequence of that. And so the barons, quite understandably, decided that they wanted to to get rid of John's powers, as it were, and put them under control. And that was Magna Carta. And the key thing about the Magna Carta, which was 1215, was it said that the king was under the law. And that was a revolutionary concept. He was not above the law, he was under the law. And from that became the idea that the king should listen, and that the king could not just arrest people and throw them into prison, habeas corpus. And Simon de Montfort took these ideas even further in 1260s, established the first parliament where you had not just nobles advising the king, but also people from the counties. And Edward I, interestingly enough, who was his nemesis, took up his idea because he needed to raise money to fight the Welsh and the Scottish. And the most legitimate way to raise money was to get money approved by a parliament. Now, parliaments were known throughout Europe. They weren't just an English institution. But the English parliaments, unlike the European ones, derived a lot more respect and authority, which meant that they could not be got rid of. I think one of the incidents that really helped cement that authority is none other than our friend Thomas Cromwell, because in this time of 1530s, when he was in charge of running the country on behalf of Henry VIII, Henry was at that point in time trying to break with the Church of Rome, and also he wanted the properties of the monasteries. Both these things were quite potentially unpopular. So it worked in Henry's favour, and Thomas Cromwell saw that it worked in his favour, to use Parliament as the means by which these things were achieved, thus deflecting some of the opprobrium from Henry VIII. But that meant that Parliament was gaining authority and respect. Elizabeth was no great lover of parliaments, but knew she had to call them, even got annoyed at them because they kept on telling her that she needed to get married, and also started talking about Christian things, which she wasn't too impressed with. However, she kept her parliaments happy. Unfortunately, her successors, the Stuarts, were not so wise, and James I and Charles I treated their parliaments pretty roughly and often didn't call them for years at a time. And this led to the Civil War. And that was in 1642 to 1645. The king lost, and ultimately in 1649, Charles I lost his head. The ensuing 11 years of a republic wasn't exactly glorious in some ways. Oliver Cromwell effectively became a dictator because parliaments aren't altogether that good at running countries. But that said, when the monarch was restored, the monarchy under Charles II in 1660, it was very clear from now on Parliament was the top dog, not the king. And this was further cemented when James II tried to introduce Roman Catholic officials into the nation. That was the successor of Charles II. And he was chased out the country in 1688 and replaced by a Dutch king, William III. And William III, and what's called the Glorious Revolution of 1689, established once and for all parliamentary sovereignty. And it's really from 1689 that the current English system of parliamentary sovereignty has been established. The significance of that is that, of course, this feeds into the American understanding of democracy. And obviously the French drew from this when they were having their revolution in 1789. There's a bit of a debate about what form of democracy should take, and the difference between, let's say, the British or Anglo-Saxon form of democracy and the continental European one. But that's a debate for another time. But hopefully you've got a little bit of a flavour of the growth of Christianity, the re-establishment of Christianity, and also the development of parliamentary democracy, which is a very important characteristic of our modern world. Thank you for listening.